Welcome back. Paul Mitchell is the owner, the man who created Redistricting Partners, a consultant group out of Sacramento. He's the guy who actually drew the lines that were Proposition 50 and that are being challenged in court. He joins us from Sacramento. Mr. Mitchell, thanks for taking the time. Listen, I know there's very little you can talk specifically about the lawsuit that the Republican Party has filed in federal court to try to return the congressional districts back to what the previous independent commission had drawn. They say your maps violated the Voting Rights Act. But generally speaking, when they make the argument that you disenfranchised voters in California, you split up communities, how do you respond?
So there's a couple different things. One is their lawsuit, and they've had a few lawsuits that have been thrown out, but their lawsuit suggests that what we did was follow the same rules that the State Redistricting Commission created in terms of the Voting Rights Act. And like you said, lawyers will figure this all out, and so that's not really my part. But in terms of communities of interest, we worked to try to maintain as many of the communities of interest that were identified by the State Redistricting Commission. We, reduced the numbers of cities that were split. And then also you can look at the independent studies of our districting plans. So Public Policy Institute of California said that we created a map that essentially was the status quo for communities of interest, and in fact, maybe made some improvements for the Latino community. The Asian Studies Center at UCLA came out with a study that said that we improved the voting power of the Asian community of interest. And then Cal Poly Pomona and Caltech came out with a more extensive study looking at potential Voting Rights Act issues with the Latino community and said that we made improvements for the Voting Rights Act. So those analyses that were done after the fact that are all independent say that we did a pretty good job with these maps. And this lawsuit essentially is trying to make a claim that we followed the same rules as the State Redistricting Commission. The real risk potentially, as I'm sure we'll talk about, is the federal lawsuit that is happening out of a case in Louisiana the Supreme Court heard. That's something that's probably a more serious potential future impact, maybe not so much this lawsuit.
Let's talk about that. The Voting Rights Act was designed to help minority voters elect people who they want as their representative without being hampered by a majority of white constituents. That race has to be taken into account. That's what the Supreme Court is questioning, and we have a conservative majority that may indeed gut the Voting Rights Act, just essentially dismantle it. If that happens, what happens to the districts that we just approved?
So you're right. The Voting Rights Act does change the way you draw lines. Whenever we do redistrictings, and we've done over 100 in California, I also was the demographer for the state of New York independent redistricting process. Whenever we do this, we work with attorneys because attorneys need to kind of sign off on a three-part test that was identified going back to the 1980s by the Supreme Court when you're dealing with these minority communities and potential Voting Rights Act claims. So what they're suggesting in this lawsuit out of Louisiana is that maybe this law that has been, or the way the law has been interpreted in these three-part tests, maybe it's just not relevant anymore. Maybe we shouldn't have these same kind of rules. The argument being that aren't we entering into a more post-racial world than we were in back then in the 60s when the Voting Rights Act was first started, or in the 80s when this three-part test was created? I think that we're really going to potentially see a huge shakeup in our congressional districts nationally. If this happens, you could even see City of Los Angeles redistricting having to be redone, or the County of Los Angeles. You could see literally thousands of redistrictings put under a different set of rules if the court were to change the laws around the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, the narrative, though, from the Republican Party is that Democrats get a big boost from the Voting Rights Act. If that's taken away, you could see a loss of 10 to 20 congressional seats nationally. Do you believe that?
It's situational. So like in California, you might be able to draw more Democratic seats if you weren't concerned with, say, making sure the community in Santa Ana that's heavily Latino is kept together in Orange County. Whereas in the South, breaking up historic Black districts would probably allow them to draw more Republican seats. So it might be situational to the state and its certain demographics and the way the political realities of that state. And so I think that it would nationally advantage Republicans to get rid of the Voting Rights Act, but it might be different in a particular state.
So there's also this school of thought that after looking at the results in California, that Republicans in other states, Florida, Ohio, elsewhere, may say, listen, okay, we're going to redistrict in order to elect more Republicans. But one also wonders that the amount of support Democrats saw on Tuesday was perhaps predictive of a wave in 2028. So be very careful. If you're going to redraw congressional districts on behalf of Republicans, because you are going to decrease the margin of victory in some of those districts. And in a wave election, you could actually lose more seats than you gained.
Yeah, in a very real example, they took seats in Texas that were 20-point Republican advantage districts, made them 10-point Republican advantage districts in order to make another Democratic seat a Republican opportunity. Well, what happens if there's an 11-point Democratic wave in 2026? Then you lose both those seats. And so that is called a dummy mander. When you redistrict to try to seek a political advantage and then it backfires on you, it's a very real potential risk going into 2026 for Republicans, less so for Democrats, because if there's a Democratic wave, it means that these Democratic seats that have been drawn would be even bolstered more beyond what they're currently at. But for Republicans, they need to be concerned going into what could be a Democratic wave election.
Paul Mitchell is the owner of Redistricting Partners. He's the man who put together the maps that we voted on Tuesday. Mr. Mitchell, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.